Hello everyone, and welcome to The Painting Paladin. My name is Justin, and this is the 7th and final part in our Adepticon miniseries. The time has finally come, and Papa Smurf is readying himself for battle. While wearing the Shroud of the Saint, Papa Smurf rides into battle from his carriage. His presence heroically inspires those Smurfs around him to fight harder. So with that being said, let's head on over to the work desk and get started on this final part, shall we? Alright, now before we begin, I undercoated this model with Gray Seer spray. Now you also might have noticed that the model is left unassembled, and the reason I did this is so that we can get the undersides to all those models and reach those hard to reach places before gluing them down and they become even harder to reach. The first part that we're going to be painting is the chassis of the carriage. Now the first color that we're going to be using is the contrast paint, Warp Lightning, and we're going to be using this to paint all the vines. Once that Warp Lightning is dry, we can move on to our next color, and that's going to be Elysian Green. Now this time, however, we're going to be applying it using a different method that we haven't used so far. We're going to use a sponge and stipple this color on. Now if you're not familiar with it, the stippling technique is very similar to that of a dry brushing technique. Now you're just going to take your sponge, dip it into your paint and wipe most of it off onto a paper towel, and then gently pat the area that you want with your stipple sponge. Moving on, the next color that we're going to be using is Moot Green, and we're going to be applying this using the dry brushing technique. Now we're just going to be dry brushing the top of the vines here to give some highlighting in the areas where the sun would hit. Once that dry brushing is done, we can move on to our next color, and that's going to be Wraithbone. Now we're just going to use this color to paint the stems of the mushrooms that are the wheels. With that Wraithbone dry, we can move on to our next color, and that's going to be Mephiston Red. Now we're just going to use this to paint the mushroom caps. Okay, so the next color that we're going to be using is White Scar, and we're going to use this to apply small white circles onto those mushroom caps there. Now we're going to be applying this a little bit different than what we normally do. So what we're going to do is dip our brush into our paint, wipe some of it off, and gently dab our brush there to make that circle pattern. Alright, so the next color that we're going to be using is Agrax Earthshade. Now we're going to be applying this on the outside of the mushroom caps here to give them a little bit of definition, as well as to the inside of the mushroom cap where the spores would normally be located at. With that wash dried, this first part of the model is finished, and we can move on to the next part, and that's going to be the ant riders. Alright, the next part of this model is going to be painting the ant riders. However, they are painted exactly the same way as I did in my previous video, the ant rider cavalry, so I'm going to be skipping over recording this part. With the ant riders all finished up, we can move on to the next step of this project, and that's going to be gluing the ant riders and the carriage chassis down to the base. Now first, what we're going to do is test fit everything and make sure the positioning is correct. Once you're happy with the placement of everything, what you're going to do next is pick the models up one at a time, add a couple dots of glue to their feet, and glue them down to the base. Now the reason we're doing this now, instead of waiting until the model is all finished, is because it makes it easier to base the model with the basing materials, and get into those hard to reach spaces. Now once everything is glued down, we can base this part of the model. Now we're going to be basing this the same way that we did as the rest of the army as seen in the first video, the Smurf Spearmen. Now once that's done, we're going to set this aside and move on to the next part of the project, and that's going to be painting the body of the carriage. Alright, now the first step in painting the body of the carriage is going to be using the contrast paint, Plaguebearer Flesh, and we're going to be applying this all over. Alright, with that Plaguebearer dry, we can move on to our next color, and that's going to be Orruk Flesh. Now we're just going to be applying this as a dry brush all over the model. Moving on, the next color that we're going to be using is Moot Green. Now just like before, we're going to be applying this as a dry brush just on the top of the model here where the sun hits it. The next thing that we're going to be painting is the stitching that holds the body of the carriage together. Now the color we're using for this is Rhinox Hide. So just take your time and be careful when painting this so that you don't get any of that on any of the green that you just finished painting. Once that Rhinox hide is dry, this part of the model is finished, and we can move on to the next part, and that's going to be painting Papa Smurf's bodyguards. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is paint the female Smurf bodyguards. Now as you can see, there are two of them, and they have different hairstyles. That's the only difference between these two models, so I'm only going to be focusing on one of the models for the videos. Now the first color that we're going to use is Baharroth Blue, and that's to paint all the exposed skin areas. Now in going back through my recordings while making this video, I had noticed that I had forgotten to record the next step, and that's to paint Guilliman Blue glaze right on over that Baharroth Blue. Once that Guilliman Blue glaze is dry, the next color that we're going to use is Gray Seer, and that's to touch up any of the areas we might have gotten that blue on, as well as to make sure that we have a smooth and even coat on all the clothes there. Moving on, the next color that we're going to be using is Apothecary White, and that's going to be applied to her hat, dress, and shoes there. Alright, once that Apothecary White is dry, the next color that we're going to be using is Iyanden Yellow, and that's going to be for her hair as well as her eyebrows. Alright, so the next color that we're going to use is Steel Legion Drab, and that's to paint the shaft of the axe there. The next color that we're going to be using is Rhinox Hide, and that's to paint the little hand grip on the axe there. Moving on, the next color that we're going to be using is Leadbelcher, and that's to paint all the metal parts on the axe there. Once that Leadbelcher is dry, the next thing we're going to do is give the axe a wash, and the color we're using for this is Nuln Oil. Once that wash is dry, these two female Smurfs are done being painted, and we can move on to the next and last piece of this model, and that's going to be Papa Smurf. Alright, now when painting Papa Smurf, the first color that we're going to be using is Baharroth Blue, and that's to paint all the exposed skin areas. The next color that we're going to be applying is Guilliman Blue Glaze, and that's going to be applied right on over that Baharroth Blue. Now when applying this, just make sure to watch for any pooling, but if you do get pools, just use the tip of your brush and soak them up. Moving on, once that blue is dry, the next color that we're going to use is the contrast paint, Blood Angel's Red. Now we're going to use this to paint Papa Smurf's hat, pants, boots, and the little berries that are on his staff there. The next color that we're going to use is Evil Sunz Scarlet. Now that's going to be painted on the raised areas of the red that we just painted, avoiding those deep recesses. The next thing that we're going to do is paint the leaves that are on his staff, and the color we're using for this is the contrast paint, Plaguebearer's Flesh. Next, we're going to use the color Steel Legion Drab, and that's to paint Papa Smurf's staff. Once that Steel Legion Drab is dry, the next color that we're going to use is Rhinox Hide, and that's to paint the leather straps that are on the top of Papa Smurf's staff. Alright, the next thing we're going to do is give Papa Smurf's staff a wash, and the color we're using for this is Nuln Oil. The next color that we're going to be using is Celestra Grey, and that's going to be for the Shroud of the Saint, Papa Smurf's beard, and eyebrows. Alright, so the next color that we're going to be using is Apothecary White, and we're only going to be applying this on the Shroud of the Saint. And lastly, the next color that we're going to use is White Scar. Now we're just going to be painting this on all the raised areas of the Shroud of the Saint there, avoiding all those deep recesses where the Apothecary White had settled. With that white scar dried, Papa Smurf is finished, and we can move on to the next step of this project, and that's going to be assembling everything for the body of the carriage. The first thing we're going to do is glue Papa Smurf to his bench in the carriage there. Now we're just going to add a small dot of glue to his butt and try to get the model centered. The next thing I'm going to do is glue the two female Smurfs to the carriage there. Now I'm just going to add 2 dots of glue to the bottom of their feet. Now they're going to be to the left and the right of Papa Smurf so that they can protect him from any incoming attacks. Now the last thing I'm going to do is glue the body of the carriage to the chassis of the carriage. Now I'm just going to add 4 small dots of glue to the supports that I made and just make sure that everything is centered and lined up the way it should be. Alright, with Papa Smurf based and ready for battle, he can lead his Smurf forces to victory at the Clash of Kings. Now, a few things to remember when painting this. The first is I left the model only partially assembled and painted those parts individually because it's easier to paint the undersides of the models as well as to guarantee that there are no missed spots. The second is to plan your colors out beforehand so you have what you need and you know where you're going to use it. The third is, as always, take your time to avoid any mistakes, but if you make any mistakes, you can always go back to your previous colors and correct it. And lastly, and this is perhaps the most important one, have fun. Model painting is supposed to be enjoyable, but if you turn it into a chore, it can become not fun, even dreadful. And this is a hobby where you're supposed to have fun. Now at the end of this video, I will have the entire army assembled and ready to march. So if you want to see the final look of the army, stay tuned. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, as well as the entire series. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you want to stay up to date with future videos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thanks everyone.